Are you eating enough salt to support optimal mental and physical health? And how much is too much? Hi, I'm Dr. Patricia Mills, holistic medical doctor, transforming women's health with a root cause approach. And today on the Wild Wisdom Show, we're going to be talking about the truth about salt, how much you really need for optimal health. And this might surprise you. We're going to be covering things like debunking salt myths, the sweet spot for salt intake, two things you need to have with salt and one thing you need to avoid for optimal health, whether you should be using table salt versus natural salt, and 5 tips for a healthy, safe salt intake. So let's start off with the salt controversy because this has been a big one over the last few decades. Now, salt is good. Animals actually seek salt licks, and in history of humans have even traded salt for gold. Salt has been worth its weight in gold in the past, and many communities actually developed along salt trading routes because inland they didn't have access to salt like they did in coastal areas. And so there were trading routes for salt, and if you can trace back certain histories, people would actually live along these trading routes for salt access. So clearly, there's something good about salt. But then recently, there's been concern about salt causing issues like increased blood pressure. But today, we're going to be debunking a salt myth, which is that salt causes hypertension, heart attacks, and strokes. So let's look into this myth and understand that the thinking that salt causes problems with hypertension related deaths like stroke and heart attacks is as a result of limitations of previous studies. So let's get into this. Now, studies on salt have often focused primarily on an increase in blood pressure, but not whether or not it causes an increase in the diagnosis of hypertension or death from heart attack and stroke. So the thing is that increasing your blood pressure doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. Some people even suffer from blood pressure being too low. So, an increase in blood pressure doesn't necessarily mean a bad outcome. Now, we know that having a diagnosis of hypertension when your blood pressure reaches a certain level, that can increase your risk of things like heart attacks and strokes. So, generally speaking, avoiding or reducing hypertension diagnosis reduces your risk of heart attacks and stroke. But is that related to salt intake? And that's where we need to go a little bit deeper into the research to get a clear understanding of, does salt actually increase your risk of the diagnosis of hypertension, heart attacks, strokes, and death from any disease? And now there's this exciting study that is shedding light on this topic because instead of just looking at whether or not salt increases blood pressure, it actually looked at outcomes which cause death, like heart attacks and stroke. It looked at the total diagnosis of heart attacks and strokes, as well as a diagnosis of hypertension, in addition to the usual looking of blood pressure changes. And they looked at this in relation to what's called the urinary sodium excretion, which I'll explain to you why researchers use that for looking at salt intake. So, in this study, they had about 3,600 participants that started off without any cardiovascular disease, so no history of hypertension, stroke, or heart attacks. And they followed this group for a median of 8 years, so for some less and for some more. So, a pretty long term follow up study, which was great. And the researchers looked at how much sodium was being eliminated or excreted through the kidneys as a approximate for salt intake, because historically it's very hard to estimate how much salt people are actually taking in, because as we're going to discuss, it's not just about the salt that you add to your foods when you're cooking, it's the hidden salts in restaurant foods and ultra processed foods. And so when we eat sodium from salt, so one of the minerals in salt is sodium, the body typically uses what it needs and gets rid of the rest of it out through the kidneys. So it excretes it through the kidneys. And so what we found is that in research, a better way to measure salt intake is to actually measure how much sodium is being excreted through the kidneys. And that's what this research and many other researchers on salt use. Now, the surprising result with the study was that people who consumed more salt or had more sodium excretion had fewer deaths from hypertension related problems such as heart attacks and strokes. So that was the opposite of what they expected to find. And actually, the lowest salt intake group had the highest death rate. That was extremely surprising. Whereas the highest salt intake group had the lowest death rate, death from any causes. And actually, the amount of salt that people consumed didn't affect their chances of developing hypertension. So they looked at this even closely because that was very, very surprising for them. So when they looked at this more closely, they found that for every extra 100 units of salt consumed, the systolic blood pressure, which is one of the units of blood pressure, so we have systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure, and those two numbers together make up your total blood pressure. The systolic blood pressure went up by 1.7 points, but the diastolic blood pressure didn't change. And if they divided the groups into the lowest salt intake and the highest salt intake, how much salt you had did not affect your chances of being diagnosed with hypertension. So, actually reaching a level of blood pressure that put you into the diagnosis of having hypertension. So, the conclusion from the study, which the researchers were quite surprised, is that eating more salt was linked to a small increase in systolic blood pressure, but it didn't lead to more diagnoses of hypertension or an increased risk of heart attacks and strokes or death. In fact, people who ate less salt or had the lower sodium excretion had a higher risk of death. Now, why could this be? Why would be that not eating enough salt could lead to an increased risk of death? And for this, we need to understand what are the roles of sodium, which comes from salt. What are the roles that sodium has in the body? And we know that sodium is very important for fluid balance. How much sodium you have will dictate where the fluid stays in your body, if it stays in your blood vessels or goes into your tissues and causes things like edema. So not enough can cause issues with that. Too much can cause issues with that. So having enough salt is important for proper fluid balance in the body. Sodium is also crucial for nerve function. So function of the brain, function of the spinal cord, and those nerves that send information from the brain and spinal cord out to the body and back into the brain and spinal cord. So nerve function relies on sodium concentrations. Muscle function also relies on having enough sodium, as does nutrient absorption. Sodium helps us absorb certain nutrients, and it's crucial for cellular health. Every cell in your body requires a certain amount of sodium to function optimally. So it might not be so surprising anymore to discover that if you don't actually have enough salt, you could actually have a higher increased risk of death. And that's what this study found. So now let's look at other studies to see if we can confirm this finding and to see if we can find the sweet spot for salt. What is too little and what is too much? So let's dive in. And the good thing is that there is research that sheds a light on this. And if you're joining me live, please feel free to put your questions in the comments. I'd love to answer them for you. So here we go. A number of studies, and this one I'm highlighting shows that if you want to keep your blood pressure low, so let's say you're like, okay, I know it's not going to increase my risk of hypertension, but I also don't want my blood pressure to creep up too much. What they found was that the highest blood pressure increase was in those that were excreting more than 6 grams of sodium a day through their kidneys. And don't worry, I'm going to convert this into how much salt per day this is, okay? And I will be giving that value very shortly. So we know now that over 6 grams of sodium excretion per day puts you at a higher risk of your blood pressure going up. So not necessarily getting the diagnosis of hypertension, although of course, if you're eating a lot more salt than that, you could get into that problem. But this study, which is called the urinary sodium and potassium excretion mortality in cardiovascular events, actually looked at that sweet spot of too high and too low. And they found that both high and low sodium excretion were associated with an increased risk of death and cardiovascular disease. So what was too high? Again, more than 6 grams of sodium excreted per day, which is in keeping with all of the other studies. And less than 3 grams of sodium excreted per day increased risk of death and cardiovascular disease. So the risk of death and disease is just as high having not enough salt as it is having too much salt. So that's an important take home point. So, what is that sweet spot? Now, 3 to 6 grams of sodium excretion per day, based on studies have looked at this, equals about 1.5 to 3 teaspoons of salt a day. Now, you have to understand that this number is not an exact number. It really depends on your genetics, on, how your kidneys are working. So this number is based on a number of studies that have been done on men and women, and this variation also changes if you're male or female, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb that you want to stick to about 1.5 to 3 teaspoons a day. So, not too much less than that and not too much more than that, to stay within that sweet spot of just enough sodium and other minerals that make up salt for healthy brain and body function. Now, this is interesting because the World Health Organization recommends that adults consume no more than 5 grams of salt a day, which corresponds to just under 1 teaspoon of salt per day. Now, I don't want you to get confused because how much salt you eat. So, eating 5 grams of salt doesn't mean you excrete 5 grams of sodium. I had to use various different studies and calculations to reach the amount of 1.5 to 3 teaspoons a day to get that 3 to 6 grams of sodium excretion per day. So it's not that we're converting 3 to 6 grams of salt into teaspoons. That's not what we're doing. So here we go, just really making that clear that we're looking at 1.5 to 3 teaspoons a day as being equivalent to the sweet spot. And yet the World Health Organization is recommending under 1 teaspoon of salt per day. So it may mean that this recommendation needs to be updated with this new way of looking at the research of, there being such a thing as too little, and that the too high spot is actually not 1 teaspoon, but it can be as much as 3 teaspoons, which, when you think about it, really makes sense. If you were to limit your cooking to a total of 1 teaspoon of salt per day, that would really be hard to cook tasty foods. And I've cooked, the Mediterranean diet. I've gone to Italy to learn how to cook their foods. And in Italy, they eat the Mediterranean diet, and it's supposed to be one of the best ways of eating in the world. Everybody agrees on that. And they definitely use more than 1 teaspoon a day of salt, for their cooking, for an average person to eat for the day. So this finding is more in keeping with those traditional methods of cooking of 1.5 to 3 teaspoons of salt consumption per day. Now, what you have to understand is that there are modifying factors. There are things that you have to eat and drink and things that you have to avoid in order to not have problems with any amount of salt in your diet. And number one is that the quality of your diet matters. So, the largest source of dietary salt in North America, and now this is becoming true for most other countries in the world that are adopting a North American style diet, is around 70% actually comes from processed and packaged foods and restaurant foods. It's not coming from the salt that you're adding to your food at home. And so, packaged breads, a lot of the breads that are made and put into packages and they last a really long time on the shelf have a lot of hidden salt in them, which is different from the bread that your baker makes, that fresh bread, or the bread that you make at home. Sourdough bread has the least amount of salt because it has a lot of flavor from the fermentation sourdough process, whereas non-sourdough bread, they tend to add more salt to add more of that flavor. Packaged pizzas, packaged sandwiches, processed meats, and canned or packaged soup have a lot of salt added into them. Also, things like homemade salad dressings and tomato, pasta sauces and things like that. They simply have more salt than you would naturally add at home if you were making your own version of those foods. The other thing is that these processed and packaged foods are also lacking elements that change the effect of that change the effect of salt on our health, such as potassium and water. So now I'm going to get into the importance of potassium and hydration when it comes to the conversation on salt. Because sometimes we focus on the trees, we're looking at one thing, which is salt, but we have to look at the forest. What is the salt coming with? Is it coming with enough potassium and water hydration to offset any potential negative effects? What we know is that higher potassium intake is associated with lower blood pressure. And isn't it interesting that whole foods like fruits and vegetables are very high in potassium, whereas processed foods are, by definition, low in potassium? Also, drinking enough water is very important to dilute the salt eaten in our diet and help counteract any potential harmful effects of eating too much salt. And we know that eating salt, which is composed of various minerals like sodium and chloride and so on, is different from drinking mineralized water. So, mineral water, which has these minerals in it, these minerals in water act to make that water better at being absorbed by your body, which means better hydration, because that mineral in the water becomes an electrolyte. And we all know that adding electrolytes to our water, as long as we don't add too much, actually improves the ability of that water to hydrate our tissues. And so when we talk about mineralized water versus non-mineralized water, you want to use the mineralized water if you have that option. I actually have a video on YouTube as part of the Wild Wisdom show describing how to mineralize your water at home using natural salts. And one of the most common questions I get is, well, is adding salt to my water going to put me at an increased risk for blood pressure being too high? And the answer is no, because it's now you're adding the salt to become an electrolyte in the water, which is very different from adding salt to food, especially if it's coming in very dry food like that ultra processed packaged foods. Then the question next becomes, should I be eating table salt or should I be eating natural salt like Himalayan salt or Celtic salt? And here we go. There is an answer to this question, and it really is, the answer is it depends. So table salt, also known as refined salt, comes from underground salt deposits, so natural sources of salt, but then it's heavily processed to remove minerals and impurities. So it becomes primarily sodium chloride, one sodium and one chloride mineral stuck together. So you're only really getting two minerals in table salt. Also, they often add these anti-caking agents, so these chemicals, to prevent the salt from clumping. So there's some added chemicals to that you may not be wanting to have added to your salt. However, most table salt is fortified with iodine, and iodine is an essential nutrient for thyroid function. So we've got to keep that in mind when we next talk about natural salts. So natural salts like Himalayan salt and Celtic or Celtic salt are minimally processed and they retain trace minerals from their original sources. So, for example, Himalayan salt is mined from the ancient sea salt deposits in Pakistan. And the salt from there contains at least 10 different minerals and trace elements. And many of these minerals and elements are very important for bodily function, even in teeny tiny amounts. So, chromium being an example, and chromium deficiency can actually increase one's risk for diabetes, for example. So, having those natural salts may actually be important for our health. Celtic salt, also known as gray salt, originates from a coastal region in France, and it's harvested from tidal pools where that seawater evaporates slowly and salt crystals form. So it's a very natural type of salt formation. However, these natural salts often lack enough iodine. So, if you're someone who's chosen to eat natural salts and use natural salts instead of table salt, I highly recommend that you look into adding seaweed to your diet, or else you may be lacking iodine, which is very important for thyroid functioning. So, for example, I'll add some dried seaweed to the cooking water that I use to cook my rice. I'll add dried seaweed to my bone broth or my vegetable broths or my stews or my soups. And that way, that makes sure that I have a very good, consistent source of things like iodine, which are very important for thyroid health. Now, one question that has come up very frequently in the use of natural salts is, well, what about heavy metal contamination? Are these salt deposits contaminated by heavy metals? And does eating table salt reduce our risk of heavy metal contamination? And the answer is no. Both salts have heavy metals in them, both table salt and natural salts. And the reality is that our body's ability to detoxify heavy metals comes from the very fact that heavy metals are present in the Earth's crust. They're naturally present. So, organs like our liver were designed to be able to process heavy metals. So, I'm not concerned about the natural presence of heavy metals in the Earth's crust, in our salts. I'm more concerned about the deposition of heavy metals from unnatural sources such as lead from burning gasoline, for example, or a deposition of lead from paint, added to paint and the paint leaching into our soils. That is more problematic because now you're getting much heavier doses than the body can handle. And the body then starts to store the lead in things like our bones, and it can start to interfere with body function. So, again, I'm not as concerned about heavy metal being present in things like salt. We've been using salt as a society for centuries, thousands and thousands of years. And we've been using the natural salt. So we don't have problems with that. The increase in problems with heart attacks and strokes really happened in the 1900s, started increasing. And so it's something more recent that's become a problem for our risk of heart attacks and strokes, rather than a very long, standing issue with the fact that there are heavy metals in the soil and our body is able to handle them so long as they come from natural sources. So I'm going to give you next 5 crucial tips, five crucial tips in order to properly eat your salt. Now, there have been some questions here. And so, for example, Dr. Shea is showing up today. Hello, nice to see you again. And she's wondering, is it okay to buy mineral water from Costco? So the thing is, here's the thing about buying water. First of all, water, when it's bought, should ideally not be bought in plastic bottles, because the plastic from the bottle can leach into the water and cause microplastic contamination of your water with things like bisphenol A, which is known to harm hormone production in the body. It's a known hormone harming molecule. So you do not want to buy bottled water from anywhere, even if it's mineralized. So now you're looking at buying water in glass bottles. And as long as it's in glass bottles and it's from a clean, mineral rich source, that's fine. I would not buy bubbly water. Bubbly water is carbonated, it's naturally more acidic. When you add carbonation or when carbonation is naturally present. And over time, that can cause problems with your bone health. I've covered that before in my anti-osteoporosis nutrition video. Again, you can find that on my YouTube channel under my bone health playlist. So flat water that's not bubbly and it's mineralized, which you can either buy in glass bottles from stores, or you can make at home for a much cheaper price using things like Himalayan salt or Celtic gray salt. So again, I'll be putting the links to that video in the caption on YouTube. And to find the caption, you look below the video and you may need to click on the read more button to expand the words so you can find the links and go and watch those videos afterwards. Dr. Shea is saying, what brand of salt do I recommend? Honestly, I just look for either a pink salt or a gray salt, and that's what I buy. I want to make sure that they're coming from the sources that they say, like Himalayan from Pakistan, or maybe it's coming from another mineral location, the Celtic salt from places like France. Just being aware of the fact that usually natural salts have some kind of color to them, like a pinkish tone or a grayish tone, whereas a white salt is usually been pretty refined to remove all those other minerals that give the salt that color. So I hope that helps. Okay, so 5 tips for safe salt intake. Tip number 1, reduce your processed food consumption and focus on whole foods. This is so important because if you're not reducing your processed food consumption, you may be eating too much salt already. You're probably going to be consuming more than 3 teaspoons of salt per day just from those processed foods. So again, some tips are Buy bread from your local baker, freshly made, right? Make your own bread if you have to at home. If you're worried about how much salt that they're adding in there, try avoiding buying that packaged bread because that's where a lot of salt is hiding out. Make your own salad dressings, make your own pasta sauces if you can, or at least look for the salt content in those sauces. Look for soups that don't have added sodium. Maybe make your own soups if you can, but be aware of the fact that all of these packaged or processed foods usually are the biggest source of salt, and that's what's going to put you over the edge for your salt consumption. And when you minimize your ultra processed food intake, you can then season your foods to taste at home so that they're tasty, right? You need a little bit of salt to make those eggs tasty and those vegetables tasty and that, the meat or whatever it is that you're eating. So that second tip is to season your home cooked meals with salt, but you want to aim for a total of 1.5 to 3 teaspoons of salt per day from all foods, including processed foods. So when you're minimizing your processed foods, it's easier to keep track of how much salt you're adding to your diet because it's just from what you're adding, which is much easier to keep track of. Tip number 3 is aim for adequate hydration, around 2.5 to 3.5 liters of mineral water daily, and see my video in the caption again on how to mineralize your water using natural salt so you can avoid the plastic water bottles and also save a ton of money. So you don't have to buy electrolytes and you don't have to buy bottled water if you don't want to. Tip number 4 is aim for 6 to 9 servings of vegetables and 2 to 3 servings of fruits a day. They have many health benefits, and they also have that level of potassium that is so important for keeping your blood pressure within a healthy range. So it's not just about, making sure you're hitting the sweet spot for salt, but it's making sure you're having enough potassium and hydration to balance everything out, to balance out your system for optimal blood pressure. Now, tip number 5 is so important. Individual responses to salt vary. So while we are using research on many humans and gathering the average amount of salt and what happens with that over time, you may have a genetic predisposition to tolerate more or less salt. The only way to know is to monitor your blood pressure. So you can either do that with your doctor with regular visits, or you can buy a blood pressure cuff at home and measure your blood pressure at home. If your blood pressure starts to creep up and get into the dangerously high zone, then the first thing you should do is focus on your hydration and make sure you're getting enough fruits and vegetables and decrease those ultra processed foods. So that should be your first step versus, cutting down on salting your foods to taste, because that results in very bland foods and you're less likely to be excited about cooking food at home, which is ultimately one of the biggest solutions to the too much salt problem, which is reducing the ultra processed packaged foods, making sure you're really loading up on your fruits and veggies, and salting your food to taste so that you enjoy eating those vegetables at home. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please subscribe. That's the best way to support this show. And share. Sharing is caring, and that's the best way to support your loved ones. I hope you found this helpful. And if you did, put your questions in the comments, put your insights into the comments, your aha moments. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, or night, depending on when you catch this. And I'll see you next time. Bye now.